Hi everyone, and welcome to the next part of my series on the Major Arcana. Today we're going to be talking about the Hierophant, number 5. To begin, he is very clearly the sign of Taurus, as he has this bull behind him, and he has the elephants behind him as well, which are supposed to represent the Taurian essence, basically. The idea is that elephants have a nature that is very similar to the bull, um, one that's very gentle, usually kind of large and intimidating, but not really all that dangerous per se, unless provoked. Um, and I think that this is very much also connected to its position on the tree of life, because it is the 16th path which connects Chokhmah to Chesed. Chokhmah being the father, being the wisdom of God, and Chesed is the mercy of God, sometimes known as Gedula, which is the glory. But it's being the number 4, it is associated mostly with structure, interestingly enough, and real design, basically. Because, of course, in Binah number 3, we have the concept of form that is born, essentially, or rather, impregnated. And in the number 4, we have the definite concept of a structure. Um, Granted, it's not really set into a whole lot of motion in terms of manifested motion. Of course, motion is at every level of the tree, right at beginning at Keter, because Keter is motion, essentially, is the first principle of motion. But it really isn't until 5 that it starts moving in space. So 4 is very much I tend to see, um, number 4 as space and number 5 as time. And I realize that that is sort of not quite right with some people because of the way they conceptualize Binah as time. Binah being associated with the planet Saturn, Saturn obviously being the god Chronos and time. But I think that that it's sort of more. It makes more sense to me to say Gabura represents something like time, whereas Binah is above the idea of time. Because, of course, the supernal triangle exists above the abyss, therefore it exists above matter and extension. Matter and extension is what is subjected to space and time, so therefore 4 and 5 have to be your first real ideas of those things. Um, but you can disagree. I don't think there's really a right answer because, of course, Gabora is a reflection of Binah. It is Binah in manifestation. So it's kind of saying that Binah is more the eternity of time and the eternity of I suppose, existence, whereas Gabora is more, I almost want to say subjective, but anywho, all that aside, the Hierophant is what connects numbers 2 and 4. I just dropped something. Chesed and Chokhmah. So it's the influence of God's infinite energy, infinite willpower upon his mercy, and also into this sort of body of structure. It's taking this very undefined, almost chaotic masculine force of God and putting it in a structure that makes sense. So, in other words, what the Hierophant is doing for us is taking all that basically, I don't want to say muck because that sounds blasphemous, but sort of the general mystery of God and the incomprehensibility of God because God is so unfathomable, and he basically makes it make sense, or he tries to anyway. The Hierophant is, of course, a figure very much like the Pope or any initiator into mysteries. Now, there's a big difference, however, between the Hierophant and the Priestess because they are both initiators, but we have to draw a distinction between the two of them. Um, However, they are related because the priestess is Luna, she's the planet of the moon, and the Hierophant being Taurus, the moon is exalted in Hierophant, in the Hierophant. Venus rules in him. So essentially, we can conceptualize the cards of the priestess and the empress kind of residing in the Hierophant, which is very interesting. But the priestess, if you remember, exists on the middle pillar, whereas the Hierophant exists on what's called the pillar of mercy, not the Miller of Percy. This is the first time we've really had to talk about these things because we haven't really gone far down enough. But the pillar of mercy is constructive, it's positive and masculine, whereas the pillar of severity on the left-hand side of the tree is negative, deconstructive, and feminine. Of course, this sounds misogynistic, but it's just a way of conceptualizing the universe in pairs of opposites. And the middle pillar is really the fluctuation between the two, and is the idea that, you know, Godhead really cannot be situated on either polarity, that really it's the progenitor of polarity, but really it itself is a mediant force. But anywho, so the priestess is more of, well, it's more of an internal thing, because the other interesting thing about the middle pillar, as Dion Fortune says in her book, The Mystical Kabbalah, she tells us that, you know, the middle pillar is better conceptualized as states of consciousness, whereas the left and right pillars are more, you know, things that sway one off the path, though they are perfectly relevant concepts of the universe. It's not to say that there's anything bad about them. It's just they're polar extremes. And again, the path to divinity is more one of the moderate path. Right. So the priestess is, as I mentioned in the previous video, we talked about how the priestess is like the personal reflection of God as found in the Holy Guardian Angel. And how the priestess really straddles the line between silence and speech. You know, silence being the fool, speech being the magus, and she, in between the two of them from Keter, because all three come from Keter, really is neither. And I think that's what's so mysterious about her, because she speaks to us in neither silence nor language. She speaks to us in pictures in a way, and feelings. And maybe that's what Crowley's getting at with she hunts by enchantment with the bow of Artemis on her lap. But the Hierophant, on the other hand, being Taurus and being on the pillar of mercy, is more about external things. It's more about basically taking, as I was saying, taking all that stuff that's incomprehensible and trying to put it in an image, or, you know, a hieroglyph, a symbol, that someone can understand. It's the act of putting that information in a ritual, particularly. Ritual praxis is very much connected to the Hierophant. And perhaps it suggests the idea that, you know, by ritual praxis or correct ritual praxis over time, one can come to understand the wisdom of God. Because, of course, the three paths that really represent crossing the abyss for us, of course, there are a few other than three, but the ones that I really think about as relevant in this case are the chariot on the other end, the priestess again, and the Hierophant. And all three of these really represent a kind of motion. The priestess in her camel aspect, you know, leading the wanderer across the desert of the abyss. The chariot kind of speaks for itself. And the Hierophant, in a way, is the same thing, with the ox being a beast of burden and kind of this slow, laborious work towards a goal. It's kind of the same thing, and it's saying that ritual in and of itself, the physical act of doing something, is very, very relevant in crossing the abyss. In some ways, you can see it as the card of works, as opposed to the card of contemplation. I would suggest that the chariot on the opposite end is kind of a representation of contemplation, with his meditative pose and all that. Whereas the Hierophant is more about doing. He's very much about action in the real world. It's about following the wisdom of God in one's life in all things, but particularly in a way that is habitual. Taurians are all about habit, traditionally. The other interesting thing going along with that is that the letter for the Hierophant is the letter Vav, and Vav in Hebrew means a nail. Of course, when I think of nail, my immediate thought is the nails of the Passion, but of course that's just my background. Excuse me, my quasi-Christian background. But of course, a nail in just general is something that connects and binds a structure. If you think about how many nails go into building a house, and of course we're dealing with a card that goes that leads into Chesed, number 4. And of course, how many sides does a house traditionally have? 4, because the square is considered the most rigid structure in geometry, or at least in Pythagorean kind of metaphysical esoteric geometry. The square has a very specific connotation of structure and form in the real world, of space. And so the Hierophant definitely has to do with that, that idea of construction. It's almost like the act of building the temple and then worshiping in the temple and all that, as opposed to the temple itself, which is kind of more the high priestess. So do with that as you will. But that sort of dealing with things as exterior mysteries and exterior practice definitely explains why our 4 cherubic symbols in the corners, wherever they are masks in this case, because a mask is something that you put on in order to imitate something higher. A mask, I think of also Egyptian mythology, or rather not mythology, ritual praxis, how priests would don masks of the god form that they wanted to invoke the power of. And it's very similar, while that person is not necessarily literally the god, by putting on that mask, they are inheriting its power. So the Hierophant in some ways is saying that if we adopt the ritual praxis of God as taught to us by, the Hierophant or people like the Hierophant, then we in turn can inherit the power and strength of God. This is a card that in that case can represent strength through faith, and strength through works. But with that, of course, comes the negative connotation of conservatism, too much attachment to tradition and dogmatism. So the Hierophant is a very tricky personality in that sense, because of course in this day and age no one really likes a dogmatist. I think dogma, however, is very relevant, and actually I sort of wanted to talk about this in another video, but I was watching a video on the YouTube, which I lovingly call it, by another tarot reader, and I'm not going to throw out the name even though I really want to, because it really bothered me, this video. But it was a 50-minute long video in which this tarot reader tries to explain the 22 major arcana of the Thoth deck. And he basically just goes through and, looks at a few symbols and is like, well, maybe this means, blah, 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 blah. And almost all of them are not what Crowley intended very specific symbols to represent. And it bothers me. I think there's a fine line between intuitive interpretation of a card in a subjective reading, in context with everything else, or in the context of one's own life. Obviously, the Hierophant isn't necessarily going to mean the exact same thing to me as it is to you, because we both have different experiences of it. But the card itself is still the card with the same symbolism that its authors intended. You can't just say, oh, I, see a star on his chest, so he must be really successful and really popular, and maybe there's like, celebrity gossip around him. Like, that's just BS, frankly, and really is insulting to the entire deck, to its creator. Because, I mean, when Crowley was making this deck, he saw himself as the Hierophant, and in life he saw himself as the Hierophant, for better or worse. And the idea behind this deck was creating a mnemonic device and a hieroglyphic device for storing Kabbalistic knowledge, basically, and esoteric wisdom. And it is not supposed to be a tool or a playground for people to make crap up that they think is right when they have no understanding of the real background of the card. If you cannot take the, 2 weeks or so, if not less, to read the Book of Thoth if you're going to use this deck, you have a problem. You need to read the Book of Thoth if you're going to use this deck, because these cards have very specific symbols and imageries and colors even, for very specific reasons, and I think it's wildly irresponsible to use this deck without having read that. Even if you don't understand it, at least do the author the dignity of reading the book he wrote to go with it, because he really wanted everyone to read the book if they were going to use the deck. And the reason I mention this is because the Hierophant, talking about Dogma, tarot is very much like the Hierophant. Tarot is showing us these symbols and these images that are supposed to be showing us interior truths. But it doesn't mean, just because it's an intuitive tool, it doesn't mean that, it has to become this free-range thing, entirely free-range. There must be some structure to it. And that's what the Hierophant is teaching us, that even though dogma doesn't ever taste good in anyone's mouth, it's necessary. You need to have a form to your religion, because the idea is that the universe itself has a form, and this is the benevolence and mercy of God that we're getting at in Chesed. So it's very, very important. I cannot stress it enough. That video really, really bothered me. Because this person especially considers himself quite the little authority on these things, and I just, in the comments, even people were like, have you even read the book? Like, where are you getting these meanings from? And, I am all for creative thinking with the tarot, and but again, I think there's a very big difference between saying, in my life, the Hierophant means, this aspect of my personality, or, these types of experiences in my life tend to be represented by, this card. That's something that one learns repeatedly through patterns and understanding. And again, that connects to Taurus. Taurus, the sign of labor and work over time. As I always say, religion takes work. And it's a big issue at the moment, I think, in our Western culture, because a lot of people don't want to do work with religion. I think a lot of people want to just, flip from thing to thing and not really settle on anything. Um, excuse me, and therefore end up just as confused as when they started. So I suppose, feeling inspired by the card itself, I want to take this minute just to defend the idea of dogma. Obviously, dogma is very dangerous. If I say, the sky is red because a god told me that, the sky is red and therefore it's red and you're not going to question me, that is different. Obviously dogma must be tested against the filter of experience. I always advocate that as well. But the Hierophant deserves respect, in other words. I've never felt this impassioned about this card before, but feeling it right now. Okay, so, but the other thing, returning back to the nail bit, the nail as Vav, and connecting it to the Passion and Christ, well, first of all, the letter Vav represents in Tetragrammaton the Son. Of course, Yod is the father, He, primal, is the mother, Vav is the son, and He final is the daughter. So the Vav also tends to represent Christ himself, or Christ consciousness itself. Um, so there's that significance as well. It's also the number 5. Now, the number 5 is, of course, very different from the four-based structure of the name Tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton, of course, being tetra, and 4 letters. It's the idea of the 4 elements of manifestation, the idea that the world is only conceived of as very materialistic and only having 4 directions, 4 seasons, 4 elemental bases. The idea is that the number 5 is more close to reality, and is because it includes the idea of spirit. And when we think of the number 5 in relation to Tetragrammaton, we think of the letter Shin getting placed in between all of them, Shin representing spirit, and breaking up those elements basically, and you get the name Yeshua, or Yeheshua. People say it differently, which is the Hebraic pronunciation for Jesus. So the idea is that Jesus' name itself represents the spiritual impulse in the shape of the pentagram, really, ruling the 4 elements and governing them. So the number 5 is also very important for that reason as well. The Hierophant, even though he is connected to Chesed, has this kind of spiritual impulse behind him, not only from Chokhmah, but from his number being the number 5. So that's very interesting to me as well. And the number 5 also is very much about the human. If you think we have 5 fingers, 5 toes, 5 senses, that sort of thing. So 5 is always a number that tends to get conflated with the microcosm and the world of men. So that's also, food for thought, I think, with the Hierophant. The number 5 is also the numeration for the letter He, which represents the mother and the daughter. And as I believe I talked about before, Taurus is ruled by Venus and Luna, Luna being exalted in him. And these are 2 feminine planets as opposed to the masculine sign of Taurus, which is kind of interesting. So it does have a very feminine connection as well. So the Hierophant, in many ways, is also the binding between the masculine and the feminine. And again, we return to the nail theme, the act of binding, in order to construct a perfect whole. And I think the idea is really that, every passage of time, every shift that the world goes through is a result of the interaction between the divine feminine and the divine masculine, really. And the divine feminine really represents the universe as a whole, as a latent force to be wielded. And the masculine really represents the subjective Godhead that wields that latent force. And it's, also, of course, the source, the general life source itself that constructs it and guides it into something. So the fusion of these 2 things is what gives us life, really, and is what gives us form and symbols to think about, as the Hierophant teaches us. So, of course, as always, there are other things, of course, I could talk about this card. With this card, I could mention that there are 9 nails at the top, and how 9 is the number of Yesod, but also the number of perfection. And again, being a reference to the moon, but also completion, I think, what we were just talking about. Again, that star that I mentioned before on his chest is supposed to represent the child Horus, who is born from the relationship between God the Father and God the Mother, basically. It's again representative of that Vav essence. So that's interesting as well. But it's more basically a reference to the idea that this Hierophant in particular in this deck is a Hierophant for the Aeon of Horus that we are supposedly in, according to our man Crowley. Right. So of course that is why he's got the child in the star, and the 5-pointed star again, being referenced there, the pentagram, the number 5, Sheen, or spirit dominating the 4 elements. He's also got his little wand for the 3 aeons that supposedly have taken place. And he's also, interestingly enough, got the sign for Apophis pointing down. Apophis is the destroyer of the sun, interestingly enough. So this could be representative of the idea that an old aeon has passed away and a new one is here with new rituals and new dogmas and new worldviews and new practices and that sort of thing. It's the birth of a new culture, basically. You could see it as that. But the idea, of course, being solar is that, you know, it's really the same truth, just being retooled for a different group of people, basically, or a group of people that have evolved to a certain point at this point, spiritually. That would be the basic idea. Right. Oh, the last thing I guess I could talk about that I can think of. Oh, God. Again, with all these Crowley cards, there's endless amounts of symbolism. But the bull behind him is also interesting. The bull on which he is seated, who is sort of gesturing towards the Scarlet Woman below him, or Venus and the moon, the feminine, the divine feminine. The bull is supposed to be representative of the, what is it, Midas and Pasiphae legend or something, in which Pasiphae is impregnated by Midas, not Midas, I'm sorry, that's, for goodness sake, Poseidon in the form of a bull, not Midas. I don't know where I was going with that. Gosh, no. So anywho, it's this idea of messiahness also. The idea that any redemptive god, basically, any god that is sacrificed and in doing so redeems mankind, Christ, Dionysus, Mithras, any heroic god, that basically all of these must be conceived by a father whose parentage is kind of ambiguous. In other words, he usually impregnates said woman in the form of some kind of animal, you know, Jehovah in the form of a dove, as Crowley says, for Jesus. And in this case, he's referencing the bull conceivably impregnating the woman in order to create a messianic figure, basically. This is also presenting us with the idea that any age has its Messiah, basically, that there is not necessarily just one Messiah. And of course, that's not exactly easy for people to digest either. Of course, that's going to sit sourly with, I'm sure, many people. And honestly, but I think it goes back to this idea that there is a Christ consciousness in all of us, and that all of us are kind of equally capable on some level of reaching that point. It just might take several lifetimes or less, you know, and that's when we get into the idea of divine election, and I'm not going to go there. But and then lastly, we have above him the snake and the dove, which are supposed to represent the 2 forms of love. The snake, of course, also is representative of Chokhmah as wisdom, and the dove is sort of representative of Binah as, you know, Venus-like, and I suppose peace and salt, that sort of thing. In other words, activity and receptivity. And of course, the idea is that we are supposed to choose one, which is interesting. In the Book of the Law, it says that we are supposed to choose one and choose one wisely based on the mystery of the house of God, or basically the truth of the world. And I suppose the idea is, going along with all this, that man is, whether female or male, is a masculine force that is expected to shape the world around them, basically. And in that sense, love must be, excuse me, a choice and must be active. Love is the law, love under will. And you cannot go through life receptively waiting for love. You must be active in it, because the universe itself is receptive for you. God, the universe is waiting for you to act upon it, and it's not going to be the other way around necessarily. Of course, there's some gray in that, but I do need to end this video. So if you have any questions, comments, things to add, some of you have been adding some interesting stuff to previous videos, and I really appreciate it because I've been learning from some of you, and that's really cool. That's definitely a part of doing this. So again, I hope you enjoyed it, and you found it interesting and helpful, and I'll see you in the next video when we talk about the lovers. All right? Take care. Bye.